Hello Bernard and welcome to our daily interview. Recently, you co-curated with your son Teymour the exhibition All Things Mustn't Pass, centered on the work and journey of the late Khalil Khouri, your father, and Teymour's grandfather, in the very famous Interdesign building that was designed by your father also. So first things first, who was Khalil Khouri to the modernist movement in Lebanon, to the Arab world, but also to you?
Well, Khalil Khouri is a very difficult person to frame because he wasn't just an architect. He was born in 1929 in Beirut. He's the son of a very gifted carpenter, neighborhood carpenter. So Khalil wanted to be an aeronautic engineer, not an architect initially, but not having the means to go study abroad, he ended up, he had to resort back to architecture, more reasonable choice. So Khalil, wanting to be an aeronautic engineer, had to resort back to architecture because he didn't have the means to go study abroad. The early years of the career were very interesting because he took off quite quickly. These were the glorious years of the young Lebanese Republic, so we're talking 1950s, late 50s, early 60s. So this was the time when the young republic aspired for a modern project, a lot of institutional projects. Obviously, there's a generation, the first or second generation of local moderns, who did a lot of very relevant work back then. Khalil initially, in his younger years, had, I would say, sort of socialist ideas or very social-oriented ideas, which shows in his early works. Obviously, back then, you had to have social-oriented ideas. So architecture was a political project, much more than just a technocrat practice. And then at some point, he started an industry because the grandfather passed away. So he started a furniture industry with the family. And they democratized modern furniture in the region. It became, by the mid-1960s, the most important producer of modern furniture in the region. And they started exporting even to the very difficult markets such as Europe and even the United States at some point. This is a chapter that our local history sort of forgot. But there was industrial design here. There was an industry of furniture back then. So the stuff that was designed here and produced here. I think that there was a pivotal time in 1975. And I think it was a pivotal time for him, but also for the modernist movement in the area, in the region. We've tackled this issue in the 2014 Venice Biennale with George Arbi, when we did a pavilion that was supposed to cover the whole of the Arab world. Back then, in 2014, we were supposed to survey modernist works between 1914 and 2014. And we thought that it was a very political issue in our part of the world, in the Arab world. Because 1914 is the beginning of World War I, which brings us to Sykes-Picot, which brings us to the beginning of the nation state. The notion of nation state in this part of the world. So you cannot dissociate modernism from the political dimension, and obviously the nation state and what the colonies did, the colonial forces did back then, our institutions, our institutional buildings, obviously the master plans and so on and so forth. It applies to Iraq, it applies to Lebanon, it applies to Syria, Egypt. Mainly, this is where interesting things were happening, at least relative to the Arab world. So we put back Khalil in this context. And when we reach the 1960s here, it's the Fouad Shahab years, it's the institution, it's really the golden years of the nation state project. And it shows in his body of work back then, because most of the work at the time was institutional and was very engaged politically with a lot of social-oriented ideas. This ends, for him at least, in 1975. But you would see modern architects of the period in this part of the world, you would see a very clear correlation between the bankruptcy of the nation-state project and the modern movement and the modernist ideals and modernism in general in this part of the world, and a very serious decline that happens. If anything, you can read in the facade of buildings the bankruptcy of the nation-state and the bankruptcy of the modernist movement in these Arab cities very, very clearly. And it happens within a matter of 5 to 10 years max, relatively, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq, Baas Party, whether it's in Lebanon, our so-called civil war of 1975 and on. So after 1975, Khalil Khouri, the architect, well, his office is long burned. There's a serious shift in terms of at least the command of the demand. No longer institutional projects. And at that point, his industry is rising up, is doing great. This is when he designs this building in which we did the show. We'll get back to that question later on. And he thinks that he no longer needs to set or negotiate his architecture. And he decides to stop the profession, how we perceive it, and builds very little just for friends, people he was close to, or projects of which he is a developer. Very, very strange for someone who comes from a social-oriented, project background. So, and he becomes a developer, and there's a number of developments in which he is a shareholder. But strangely, if you look at how these projects are put together, you'll see that there's always a social-oriented project behind, always a developer. And they were suicidal financially. Most of them ended up being flops financially. And same applies to the industry, because by the early mid-1990s, the industry starts also down because of shifts and changes in the industry. So there's a lot of contradiction in, it's very difficult to frame the person. I'm an architect and I remain, most of my activities remain pretty much within the territory of my practice. It doesn't apply to Khalil. Khalil was had a very broad spectrum he's done a lot of things. He was also an artist, but never sold his art, never showed his art. He was a very, very talented painter and artist, but never showed his art. Extremely difficult to frame. So someone who basically is very much of a self-made man, who has a brilliant career as an architect and starts quite quickly a very successful career as an architect, but also simultaneously becomes quite a successful industrialist and a developer, and ends his life with a spectacular financial bankruptcy and loses everything. So I'd say the ups and downs of that are also very tied to the territory, but very tied to the territory in the sense that it's a very particular and very specific modern project that you can read through his adventure. One that you cannot compare to, your typical architect career in Europe, or in the Western world, even for the very successful ones. It was very, very different here. And I think it's got a lot to do with the political conditions and the economic conditions and the social conditions and the cultural conditions. Very surprising to see that this man was also very open to Western culture as much as he was very also open to modern cultures. But the little that I know is things that that were brought to me at home during my childhood, whether it's poetry, literature, or Again, think of it as someone who grew up in the 1930s and 40s. So there was something interesting about the mandateers, the French mandateers, that we tend to forget about.
So
They didn't do that bad.
he was the product of his context in that sense.
Yes, but a very difficult product to frame. It's not this simplistic East meets West project, because there's a very specific modernity that comes out of that. And I think it becomes, what's very interesting about Khalil is that it stays very consistent and very relevant throughout his life until the end. Many of the modern architects of that period shifted in the 70s and 80s. I told you earlier that Khalil shifted, but it was extremely complex. It was not a shift that had to do with trends at all. Khalil remained extremely curious and open to progress, to science. If anything, there was a naive belief in modernity until his last breath. He kept designing planes in his 70s. He manipulated softwares, computer-aided design softwares, at the age of 60 and 70, like my Acrobat scan today. Well, the guy could draw better than anyone I've ever seen. But there are two people, to me, that had an incredible gift and talent when it comes to drawing. Two people I crossed in my life. It was Khalil and Lebanon, and no one else. It's an incredible talent in drawing. So this guy who didn't need, could create magic with a 6B and a piece of paper, and could express himself so well, didn't need computer-aided technology to express himself. Strangely, at the age of 60, 70, he is at the peak, at the top of these technologies, and spent the last years of his career surrounded by screens and supercomputers, modeling airplanes and modeling his last designs. So extremely, almost a naive belief in science and progress and technology. While a lot of the architects of this generation shifted their styles, their syntax, following trends in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I'm not going to give names, but it's very, very obvious. Architects for modernism was a trend and not a project. It is not Khalil's case. For Khalil, it was a project. It was a very serious, deep belief in a project that was political. First.
So going back to the exhibition, how did you decide to team up with Teymour to create this first ever exhibition about the life and the career of Khalil Khouri?
Well, Teymour had a very strange curiosity for his grandfather that he barely knew, because when Khalil passed away, Teymour was, I think, 8 years old. And the last 6-7 years of his life, Khalil wasn't even in Beirut. He had moved to the US. So there was always a curiosity from Teymour. And I think it was something he'd been wanting to do for a long time. And he helped me through a very difficult phases initially, which were to dig into the archives, which were very disorganized, because this is the generation of architects that do not archive and do not document things. They were doers, they were in the action, they were not in archiving like we are. So Teymour helped a lot in that respect, and was very pushing for me to do this, and he's still very active in trying to take this beyond just the exhibition. Khalil was a much more important chapter than me, I think, to his understanding of what we did before him. And I think he's right. I think there's a very, very complex and very difficult to frame story here.
So why did you choose the space of the Interdesign building not to be only the backdrop of the exhibition, but as an integral part of the display?
Well, that building is very dear to me. It was very dear to my father. This building has a very also strange and interesting story. It was conceived, as I said earlier, during the peak of his industrial project back in 1973. So back then, the company is growing. Everybody's buying the furniture, and it was the furniture for the people. So it was affordable modern furniture, which was not the case. Contemporary modern furniture were limited to the very select few who could afford the decorator, or very expensive brands, all the way until the 60s, mid-late 60s. And then Khalil brought to the market locally manufactured and conceived furniture that was conceived also relative to what they could manufacture at affordable prices here. So they're at the peak of their project in '73, and Khalil designs a building in which he's going to showcase his furniture, which is quite a luxury. I wouldn't dream of fantasizing about in my wildest thoughts today. So you have an architect who designs his furniture that he produces in a factory he owns. The factory is designed and then it's built. And the factory is designed and built according to their procedures and the processes of production. The building is conceived for producing their furniture. They reach a point where they are so sophisticated and advanced in bending wood that the machines they were buying from Italy to bend the wood were no longer sufficient. They start developing their own technologies and they start manufacturing their own bending machines in-house. So the architect designs, builds furniture in a factory is designed and built. With machines is designed and built. And now he designs and builds the showroom in which he's going to showcase his furniture. This is the absolute fantasy that I don't know of any other project, that has reached an industrial scale. You can do it at an artisanry scale, but to do it at an industrial level, where you have 300 workers and you produce at an industrial scale, is unthinkable. This is where there's something very specific again, and particularly in his career, in his project, even as an industrialist. So that building is conceived in '73. They start construction at some point in 1974. They reached the ground level in April '75 and the war erupts, so they stopped construction. And then there are, I think, a couple of aborted trials to continue to revive it through the war, but they failed to continue the construction. The war ends in the early '90s, and at that point, the geography of Beirut has shifted. Where the building is located, Teymour is no longer the ideal area where you would have a furniture showroom. The industry has shifted. The economy of Lebanon is shifting from, it was never really a productive economy, but where you could aspire for an industrial project back in the 60s. By the 1990s, it becomes purely the speculative economy, the economy of tourism, banking and finance and services, and where basically productive sector is being completely slashed. So he's paying extremely high interest rates. The laws are not helping. It takes literally 3 to 4 years to completely destroy what had been built for 3-4 decades. So by the mid 1990s, they're going bankrupt that they're not even realizing. Then by the late 90s, they're bankrupt. But Khalil decides to continue the building anyway, because he wanted to see it finished. So he continues building it also, he's in debt, and he finishes it and never uses it. So that building that's conceived in 1973, 51 years ago, has never seen the light of day. It was never used for its heroic original purpose. It is seized by the banks. A few years later, my dad is gone, and I see this building shut down, used as for a very short period of time, very briefly, as a training center for the bank, but they can't use it. They suffocate in it because it has no windows. You can't put any partition walls in it. So they leave it abandoned, and it's been abandoned for like 20 years. And we decided to revive it for 4 days. So you've got more than half a century of latency. And we revived artificially this building for 4 days. And a lot of people asked me to extend, and I decided not to, because I think that 4 days for half a century were
Not enough.
were not enough. But we're trying to revive this building for another purpose. Now we're trying to see whether the institution can take over, at least operate it, so that it becomes open to the public again.
So Bernard, what did you hope the visitor would gain or learn from this exhibition?
I wouldn't talk about learning as much as I think that there are chapters of our history that we failed in documenting, and there's a memory that's important to preserve. And I'm not talking about very objective history. I'm talking about what escapes the very consensual, simplistic, dangerously simplistic chapters of history. And I think Khalil is an exception that escapes the consensus, and it is important. And to me, it's the most interesting way of documenting a territory or a period, is to see what escapes and to try to look at the accidents. What was the limit of the possible? And I think Khalil is, in that sense, is a very interesting character because he doesn't fit the consensual history. Yet, you look at some of the stuff and it seems impossible, even for the time and certainly for today. So I think it's important that this is past, that people know about it. I was very touched to see people telling me they've been driving by this building for 50 years and they were very happy to walk in at last and see what it was about and to see this building. So yeah, I think we've failed us to write and to write our own history, formulate it at least in relevant ways, and I think we have to work on that.